Greetings and welcome, everyone. This is Judd Hendricks with Interfaith Paths to Peace, and I want to welcome you to our Monday 3 o'clock conversation, which is called The Soul of the City, Resources for Our Inward Journey. We have an exciting topic and panel, a lot of wisdom on the call today, as you can see the screen, to talk about how to help children grieve in times of crisis and change. This has been a conversation that has come up, or an issue that's come up in a lot of our IPP online conversations. And so we wanted to gather a really beautiful, broad, and deep panel of therapists, clergy, social workers to help us think about how we as a community, as we as parents, as friends of children, of community members, grandparents, can be with our children in the midst of so much change and crisis in a way that that brings healing to them. So I want to turn it over to Rabbi Nadia Saritsky, who is the program and engagement coordinator for Interfaith Paths to Peace. And welcome, everybody. Those of you that are joining us on Facebook Live, we will have an opportunity for you to join in the conversation, and you can put a comment in the comment box, and we will bring that into the conversation at the right time. Rabbi Nadia, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are so grateful to our panel. We've got people who are working in hospice, who are working in community health, who are working in our school system, who are working with kids, people who are grandparents, people who have just a wealth of experience working with kids. And the reality is that we as adults have difficulty coping and grieving. And we had a wonderful presentation with representatives of clergy. For example, we've got someone from our Baha'i community, and we had this great conversation about how can we as adults, as a community, begin to grieve. And as so many kids are going back to school or not going back to school, there is a need for us to address their unique grief as well. And so I wanted to invite first Joe Ferry from Hospice to unmute himself and tell us a little bit about who he is and some of the experience that he thinks might be helpful for the rest of us to know.
Good afternoon, everybody. Volunteered to go first because my hope was to set a bit of context that we could all agree upon about just what grief is, especially when we're talking about the younger members of our community. We all know that grief is a normal and expected response to loss, but it's also an adaptive response. It's certainly the emotion of loss we readily recognize, but it's also a physiological response to loss. It's a stress response at heart. And it's also a neurological response. Our brain literally is rewiring itself from how we related to an old experience and rewiring neural pathways to adapt to a new experience. And that's something that we don't often talk about. So I'm going to address that really quickly. But before I do that, I want to also emphasize that grief is actually an act of recreation. So it's not a passive response. It's an action response or an active doing response. And we're actually, when we're dealing with loss, we're recreating a connection with what has been lost, whether that's a person in our life or other loss. We're actually about reconnecting to that and sustaining that connection while we're also creating a pathway forward. We're creating a reconnection with our presumptive or assumptive world. We all live with assumptions we make about life, its fairness, our trust in life and how it unfolds. And grief is about reconstructing that assumptive reality over time. And it's also about creating purpose and meaning in loss. Now, sometimes we say that we can find meaning in loss, but that assumes that meaning is there, and that's not always the case. But we are uniquely predisposed as human beings to be able to create meaning from our experience. And when we can take our loss and we can find purpose in it by creating good from it, that is the hallmark of resilience, and it's a uniquely human ability. So I want to encourage us to think about grief as an adaptive response of recreation. Having said that, some of you may be familiar with the book Whole Brain Child. Dr. Daniel Siegel and Tina Payne wrote that book several years ago. And the idea was that our best response to any situation is using our whole brain. And they were famous for helping to just sort of visualize our upstairs brain, our downstairs brain, our right brain, and our left brain. And they said that our best response to grief and loss, or to adapt to change, is to engage our whole brain. What we know developmentally is most of the youngest among us are operating mostly from their right brain and also from their primitive brain or their limbic system. The neocortex, the rational brain, is kind of evolving over time. Now research is telling us that we're not completely through doing that until we're actually in our mid to late 20s. So the idea is, if we're working with youth, that we need to begin with where they are and connect with the brain they are using and connect them to the brain that they're not using, so that there's this whole brain complete response to loss. And so they recommend a couple of ways to do that. And I'm going to paraphrase that to be thinking of as we consider any kind of response, whether that's as parents, whether it's as faith communities, whether it's in the classroom, whatever response we design for children who are grieving or responding or coping with loss, we need to consider several different factors. The first one is joining. Always important to meet kids on their level. And that also means developmentally, because if we understand where kids are cognitively in their development and also in their psychosocial development, we know the tools that they have to work with and the tools they don't have to engage in their coping. So it's really appropriate, for example, when working with preschoolers, to engage their imagination and their magical thinking. That's really appropriate. That's the tools they have. And their coping is adaptive for that age if they're using their magical thinking. That might be a little different story if we're talking about a teenager who's insisting on using his magical thinking. That wouldn't be appropriate, wouldn't be what we were expecting, right? It also, when we join with them, that also means that we're meeting in community. We're meeting with other people who share similar losses, so that we're recognized, so that our loss is affirmed, but more importantly, that we understand that we are not alone in our grief. We're not the only ones this has happened to. And that gives us a measuring stick to see how others are coping, right? Which gives us hope. So the second factor would be permission. And this isn't just permission to have important conversations with our kids. It's giving them permission to share their thoughts and feelings and explore those and share those with us. And part of that is about creating safety. In order to have a safe conversation, we need to give our children control of that conversation. Even things like giving a timeout signal when we're having important dialogue, so that they have that control about how much information they take in, when they've been sated, when they've heard too much. Oftentimes when we give them the gatekeeping control, they often are much more open and go very much deeper than we would ever expect them to. And always a part of our support should be information sharing and education, sharing factual information, the idea of collective storytelling. You know, when we tell our story, we have to put that story in some kind of sequence and order. And that brings this chaos that I'm experiencing inside and puts that in some sort of sequence that helps order that on the inside. When I share that outwardly, I can validate my perceptions, correct my misperceptions with the stories others tell. But in addition to that, those questions, those things for which we don't have answers to, when we're engaging with our kids, the appropriate response to a question which has no answer is always, I don't know, I wonder about that too. Tell me what you think, because it invites further sharing from our kids. The next thing to keep in mind is expression. We want to make sure, engaging our whole brain, that we're engaging a multitude of responses. Think art, music, movement, poetry, rap, essay, anything that engages that right and left brain together, whole body response, physical movement, that's going to use our whole brain for more complete expression of that energy and more complete disbursement of that energy. And participation, this is probably the most important one. When we experience a loss or change of any kind, the idea that I can do something in this moment to affect some kind of positive change is important. And one of the easiest ways we do that is to create some sort of ritual. Ritual takes, it can be a simple, meaningful activity that helps transform that energy, but it also creates purpose. When I can find something good that can come from this loss, when I've learned a new skill, or I can take the wisdom of what I've gone through and share that with others, it gives purpose to everything I've been through. And when I find purpose in that, I find meaning. And when I find meaning, I find the ability to adapt. And the last one to keep in mind is always balance. You know, there's this whole sort of balancing act between grief, holding grief, having our nose rubbed in our grief, experiencing and mourning our grief, and taking time away from that to distract, to disappear into a video game, to play with my friends, to start, sharing humor, to distract myself in some way. I need to grieve, I need to mourn, I need to tend to my grief, but I also need to counterbalance that with time away from that. And children naturally do that. They naturally have this ebb and flow. When we see that they don't, that usually means there's something about that energy that's stuck for them. If you think about grief and loss, the natural tendency would be for us to experience a loss and, like a lightning bolt, gather all that energy, focus it, channel it, and disperse it into the ground. When that energy gets stuck somewhere inside, it's usually a sign that we're not using our whole brain to cope. So in that context, I'd like to continue the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could probably spend a week or more unpacking some of the wisdom that you just shared. And it's so helpful to begin with theory and to begin to have that understanding of the pros and cons. So I want to express gratitude to you. Dr. Barbara Head, I invite you to unmute yourself and share a little bit from your perspective.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Head, and I'm a professor at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. And for about 15 years, I taught death and grief to social workers. But I'm going to share today from a personal experience, because life is the best teacher, and show how some of the positive things were applied to a situation I was in. I had the death of a granddaughter. She was 15 and she was a twin, and she had an ATV flip over on her, and the other twin was thrown off and was not hurt at all. But Lindsay was in the ICU. She had terrible brain injury, and it was obvious that she was not going to survive. At the same time, I had a 10-year-old son who was like a brother to the twins, and so he shared that grief. Some of the things that happened well in the hospital was that it was, of course, crowded with teenagers. Their friends all came and were in the waiting room, family. There were innumerable people there at all hours of the day. But periodically, the nurses would come out and give a full report to the whole group. And it showed a lot of respect for those teenagers. It gave them the same information everybody else had, and really treated them as important people involved in this situation. I thought that was really a good illustration of being direct and sharing information when there is a loss. At the same time, my 10-year-old son and I weren't there when Lindsay died, but when she died, I just took him in my arms and told him, and we grieved together. And I think that's such an important thing, is to grieve with children and let them see you grieve, because you're their role model, and that it will really learn how to handle a loss and how to grieve from what they see the adults around them doing and how they're acting in response to the loss. So I think that's a very important fact for all of us. And then I think that it's very important to have those that, as time goes on, to have some way to remember the person that died. When Lindsay died, her mother said she was so afraid people were going to just forget her, that it was like she didn't exist. And so starting with that year, we every year bought or made an angel for their Christmas tree in memory of Lindsay. And that was kind of a linking object to let her know that we hadn't forgotten her child, which was, of course, so important to her. Of course, the death of a twin is very much a different kind of experience, and Brooke and Lindsay were best friends. So just that loss was so significant in Brooke's life, and just to affirm that and realize what she's struggling with, her whole identity changed. Whenever the girls went out, they were known as the twins, and now she was known as the twin whose sister died. And just to be aware of what she's struggling with, she really needed some intensive counseling, and even till this day, it's a part of her life that really causes her significant grief and distress at times. So those were the things I wanted to share about how I saw grief handled appropriately, mostly by the adults involved in the situation. But it's very important to include children as much as possible. If they don't want to be included, it's important to appreciate their preferences. For instance, a 4-year-old may or may not want to go to the funeral home, but they need to be prepared for what they're going to see if they do go. But you wouldn't want to force that on a child at that stage. And so I think including them in the activities of the adults around them is important as much as possible or preferred by those children. So I think that covers everything I wanted to share. Those were the most important things I learned and observed during that time of grief.
Thank you so much. There are already like a ton of questions flooding us on Facebook. So I know this is perhaps just part 2 of a much longer conversation, but I want to thank you for sharing so much of your personal story as well with us. And of course, our gratitude to you. Mark, you are next, and I wanted to invite you to share a little more about yourself and some of your.
Sure, thank you. I'm Mark Zockham. I use the pronouns he, him, and his. I am a manager at Passport Health Plan, where I supervise a few teams, including the foster care team. I was at With the Innocents for 10 years before that, as well as Family and Children's Place, and also a kindergarten teacher in pretty much another life. I feel a little bit of like a fish out of water here, because although I was raised in a Jewish household and I was trained as a therapist, I'm not really practicing either at the moment. But I wanted to kind of piggyback on what Barbara said, and said that I did feel that I learned quite a bit from the Jewish tradition and its prescribed rituals around mourning, which I'm sure you all have touched on before. And as a child, I know it greatly impacted me when both of my grandparents died within a very short period of time from each other, that I watched my dad go through the entire ritual of sitting Shiva, and then not attending parties and attending daily services and unveiling the headstone many, many months later, and then remembering the anniversaries of their deaths. And to kind of amplify what Barbara was saying, I think children seeing how adults mourn and grieve can really impact their own way of dealing with grief in a helpful and healthy way. Also, the other thing it kind of taught me, and I carried on through the years as a therapist, is I think as a therapeutic tool, prescribing the symptom or the behavior is really strong and really takes a lot of sting out of it. So in other words, if you prescribe somebody to grieve, it's almost harder for the person to have quite as much emotional oomph between it, because to talk to Joe's point, it kind of brings in their left brain as well and kind of moderates the emotionality of it. So that's the first point I'd like to make. You know, a grief is natural and healthy. It would be concerning if someone did not show signs of grief over an important loss. And I think there's different levels of grieving. There's, you know, typical grieving behaviors, which, you know, I think we see most of the time. You know, there's changes in thinking or sleeping or eating or the way a child expressed themselves. And this type of grief might just need a little extra care and consolation and TLC. Back to Joe's point also, I think you need to follow a child's lead and not give them too much information. You don't want to give them more than they're really asking for. And as he said, when you're asked the question, if you're kind of stuck, you can say, what do you think? To get a better idea of honing in on your answer. Or I think a really good response is, why did you ask that? Because a lot of times when children ask a question, what they want to know is not the answer to that question. They want to know something else. And so if you ask them why did they ask that question, then you might get a little better an idea of what it is they really want to know. I think most of us know this, but I don't think there's a really great benefit to telling a child not to be sad. It's not as bad as they think it is. If nothing else, a child doesn't really feel heard when you respond that way. I think it's better to agree with them a lot of time. If they say they're sad, I think it's great to say, of course you're sad, and you're going to be sad for a while. And I think that's also really important. And I think you have to a lot of times be, and I think this is with raising children in general, you have to be counterintuitive to what your initial response, what your gut response is, and go in a different direction. Of course, there's children and adults that grieve in a more unhealthy fashion. And we see those concerning behaviors in kids where they take big risks, or they're really explosive in their anger, they harm themselves or have suicidal ideation, they avoid help, they avoid others, they're really withdrawn. And I think those are the cases when you might seek outside help. I think hospice is, probably about one of the best resources around. There are others that also work well with children. I think, as Joe also alluded, expressive therapies and play therapies are really helpful. Depending on the child's age, they might be more helpful than talk therapy. And even for teenagers and adults, expressive therapy and play therapy, art therapy can all be really, really helpful. There's some things you can do at home that kind of mirror some of these types of activities. I think it's great to make a memory box or a memory book with drawings and writings about an individual. You can make a safe pillowcase with good pictures and words that the child sleeps on. One of the big things we always did was to write down thoughts or feelings and then burn it and let it go up into the sky wherever the child thinks it's going to go. For young kids, games like Candyland and Jenga are really good games if you tweak them a little bit. If each color is a different feeling, and when they land in that space, they have to tell you something that makes them happy or sad or angry, you know, depending on the color. You can augment that with M&Ms if you want. I think the colors match up pretty well and give them a treat. So I think I'm surprised I spoke that long after Joan Barbara. I kind of felt like I'm done here, but I guess that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that idea of using Candyland to get kids to talk, and that's really helpful. And I also loved, as a rabbi, your comparing prescribing the symptom, which is a therapeutic technique, with you're required to stay home and grieve.
Right.
That is part of the Jewish tradition of just don't leave your house for 7 days, don't go to parties for a year, like you're required to grieve, and that removes some of that. So I want to thank you so much.
Sure.
Japa, you are one of our most beloved of yoga teachers, and your spiritual depth is great. And of course, you are especially passionate with kids. So we're so grateful that you are here to share some of your immense wisdom and compassion with us.
And
So
we want to
if you
celebrate his
yourself.
birthday today.
Yes, we are
Japa's
grateful that you
birthday
have
is today. Nadia's
chosen.
going to sing happy birthday to him.
My gift to you is that I'm not going to sing. That's my birthday gift to you.
Well, thank you very much for letting me share, and hello to everyone. My name is Japa Buckner. I'm a retired Waldorf teacher. I taught in Detroit and here in Louisville. And as a Waldorf teacher, you take a group of children, usually from the 1st grade to the 8th grade. And before that, I was worked in early childhood education. I actually worked with Father Robinson, providing daycare services for his Montessori schools in the west end of Louisville. This is kind of poignant because just yesterday, a cousin of mine got on Facebook and reminded everyone that about 10 years ago, my brother-in-law and my niece were killed in a pretty horrific accident. And I guess he's probably in his late 30s, early 40s now. And he shared that he really was still struggling with that death and wanted some help with that at this point in his life. And so this grieving is really something that's challenging for a lot of people. And hopefully what everyone is saying here today will help some people meet that. I want to sort of follow up with what Joe was talking about, in that I want to address meeting children, grieving children in a learning environment, since school is starting up right now, and either in the home, you know, or different settings. Parents, teachers, and caregivers are meeting children in a learning environment, and how not only just grief from death, but trauma and grief that may come from abandonment, neglect, or abuse. I myself, I'm working as an employee at the Home of Innocence right now, so I'm meeting this on a regular basis. And so I want to, Joe talked about the importance of Basically, one thing that happens when you experience loss, of course, is that you also experience a loss of meaning. And it's been demonstrated that in terms of a learning environment, meaning enriches executive function, which in terms of impulse control, working memory, and flexible thinking. And when you lose meaning or access to meaning, either emotional or conceptual ability to contextualize your situation, your executive functioning is disenriched. And so in meeting children, we want to think about how we can help them do new meaning making. And in the Waldorf schools, we have what we consider our 4 R's that we use to meet children. And those 4 R's are reverence, rhythm, ritual, and relationship. Now, one way you can think about what's happening with the young child in terms of in a learning situation, in trying to build new meaning, is it's like trying to remember a song, a comforting song, in a way, that comforting song representing your sense of well-being that has been a little bit lost. Now, when you're trying to remember a song, you're confused about or forget what the words are. And one thing that this reverence really talks about is that we don't want to, to be reverential means that we don't want to jump in there and tell the children what we think the words are to the song that they're trying to remember. We have, as I spoke about earlier, we need to have some reverence. We need to have some appreciation for what the children are going to be bringing. So we must bring reverence for the individual character of the renewal of meaning. In analogy with the remembered song, as the grieving child struggles to remember but forgets and confuses the words, we must not too quickly insist that we know the words to this well-being that they have forgotten. Our reverence has to seek to perceive what efforts the grieving child impresses on their circumstances, whether those efforts appear functional or dysfunctional. One of the resources for their recovery is the persisting will activity of these efforts. And these efforts can be transformed by a new meaning that they can create. So we want to protect the effort making. In other words, we want to support the child's effort to remember the words as best they can. Now, so that reverence for the child's situation is crucial. But as Joe pointed out also, we need to encourage a sense of safety. A sense of safety is essential for the recovery and renewal of energy, of meaning. And one thing that informs safety for children is rhythm. Rhythm informs a sense of safety. Such rhythm, should encompass the work, play, and the cure of the grieving child. As suggested, the sense of well-being of the grieving child is like remembering a comforting song. On attempting to remember the song, sometimes you may say to yourself, oh, hum a few bars, the melody, the sense of rhythm, the melody of the song is what brings the words back. And so rhythm can have that, can hold that for children. It can be a way of bringing safety and a way of creating a sort of melody that can help the child over time begin to remember that well-being, which I'm using the analogy of a comforting song. Now, a grieving child must access tools or age-appropriate practices with which meaning can be re-internalized. And if you think about rhythm is full of transitions, and this depends on the age of the child. But again, I think Joe and some others have talked about ritual. And so one thing that we do in the Waldorf School is that we punctuate the rhythm of the day with rituals. And these rituals can be comprised by gesture, verse, song, story, and as Joe talked about, other viscerally engaging activities. The visceral engagement is very, very important when you start bringing these rituals. I give an example in a learning situation. one important ritual that you're seeing a lot is the greeting. You probably have seen all of these videos where these teachers have developed these really unique and individual greetings for children. And other rituals that you can have. For instance, when I'm working with a group of children and say there's a child who's having some difficulty composing themselves or sitting still, then rather than direct a command at that child, I may use some imagination. I may say, sitting to everyone like the royal and the wise, so that your crowns will not fall off your head. And in addressing the whole class with that little ritual, then the child has an inner opportunity to make a shift. And over time, those little rituals become, in a sense, resources that the child has for their own, to build their own new meaning making. So the grieving child's meaning making, or contextualization of experience, can help stimulate and re-enrich executive function. So there's been some recent research that shows very explicitly that children that can either emotionally or conceptually contextualize the situation that they're in have an enriched capacity for executive functioning. So in the classroom, if you are working with ritual and meaning building activities that work with the whole body, then you're giving the child resources that they can then develop and reinvent meaning that can connect them with whatever their loss is, but also potentiate future renewal. So again, we're looking at the situation where we want to give children the ability to rebuild or build new relationships. And if I use the analogy of a song again, once you remember the words of the song, then that song connects you with an experience. The lyrics of that song connect you with an experience. And then you recognize that someone else, you can share that connection to that experience with someone else through that song. And so once the children build up these meaning-making rituals that you can bring in the context of the learning environment, then they begin to have tools by which they can then share, what their meaning-making is with others and build new relationships. So the 4 R's, if you're in a learning situation: reverence for the child's experience, rhythm to build a sense of safety, ritual to give them tools and practices to build new meaning, and then out of those rituals, have ways of expressing their connections with their experiences that they can share with others in building new relationships. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Connecting that with the 4 R's was just so helpful as an organizing principle, and we're just really grateful to you for sharing. So I wanted to invite Justin, who is another one of our leaders in our morning devotional, and is also, amongst his many different roles, the leader of the Before I Die Fest, and is very helpful in our community to bring people to have conversations about grief when perhaps they would rather avoid them. So thank you so much for all that you already do with your Before I Die Fest, and wanted to give you a chance to share a little.
Thanks, Rabbi Nalia. As I look over this room of panelists, I've probably collaborated with almost 80% of you. So if I haven't collaborated with you yet, wait, you might be getting an email from me. The wisdom that I can bring to this is probably the fool's wisdom of just listening and showing up repeatedly. I don't particularly have much experience supporting children who are grieving, but I was a child who grieved, and I would say that my closest adult relationships, other than my intimate partners, has been with other children who also were bereaved as children. And so typically when I start with Before I Die Fest events, I almost always talk about my grandmother's death. And my grandmother died, and I was her healthcare surrogate when I was 25. And so the most fresh experience for me is supporting someone who is in the dying process and just kind of fumbling through it. And so that is kind of how I go through life, is I just kind of fumble through it, and I learn from the experience, and hopefully I can help somebody else on the other side. But the reason I was my grandmother's healthcare surrogate is my mother died when I was 2.5. And my mother died suddenly in an accident. And my earliest memories, my mother died in March. My earliest memories are that summer after she died. So I was 2.5, and I have some solid memories in that summer. And my earliest memories are not happy. I mean, it's very scary. My father is trying to raise a 2.5-year-old by himself, and we're really trying to orient to the world and move forward. My 3rd birthday is that following November, and 6 days after my 3rd birthday, we were in a car accident that my dad broke both hips, and we went to different hospitals. And so my solid memories are waking up in the hospital when I'm 3 years old and 6 days, and I'm in a children's hospital. And I remember that Christmas very vividly. And then my father married my stepmother that following May. So if you look at like the first 3.5 years of my life, like between 2.5 and 3.5 is a lot of change. And there was never really any time to grieve. And I did an event a few years ago with Joe and Darcy talking about grief. And I've talked to Rabbi Nadia about this, where it's like whenever you're in a room with people and you start talking about grief and you start talking about like really like heavy situations, you can feel the gravity of the room, and you can feel the weight of the room kind of building. Because I have this experience where our particular life experiences kind of can resonate with each other, and it gets real sloppy and new agey, and I don't really want to go that direction. But it's like our grief can kind of feed off of each other and kind of create an atmosphere. And I've seen that over the course of my life of hosting these conversations around death and dying, that our tendency is to back away. And so you see, and that has been my tendency, because when I was 8, I asked my grandmother about my mother, and we started talking about my mother, and we got to the point where I asked my grandmother, and I was 8, so I was just kind of not really had any filter. And I said something, and my grandmother told me about the last words that my mother said to her before she died. And that was to take care of me. And you could feel, I remember being in the backseat of the car, being really, just la-di-da, bouncing around. I asked the question. My grandfather's stonewall looking straight ahead driving, and my grandmother pauses and starts to cry. And that may be one of the last times I ever actively asked my grandmother about my mother, because I didn't know how to get past that I don't even know what you call it, but that catch. And I think we all know what we're talking about, where you feel the catch, and it's like, I retreated. And so I feel like what Before I Die Fest really is a call for everyone to learn how to not retreat and not overbear with advice or solutions, to really find out how to meet it. And I think Joe, and I'm really disappointed about COVID for many reasons, but one of the things I was looking forward to this summer was collaborating with Joe and Darcy to do some ritual at Pete Fest, and to do some outdoor exploration of how can we create space for people to come together around things. And Pete Fest is around suicide. So how can you create spaces for people to come together and find ways to orient towards this really sticky part, this part that our deepest wounds really lie, and really find the gifts and empathy and vulnerability to come together and really create something beautiful out of it. And I'm a practicing Buddhist, and I think a lot of people interpret Buddhism as being, some way to detach from the emotion, or some kind of highfalutin idea that you somehow go above it. And I'll end with Japanese poet and amateur Buddhist priest Kobayashi Isa, 18th century Japanese Buddhist. Upon the death of his child, this dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. So what I interpret this to be is, even if you can accept that life is impermanent and transitory, it still hurts, and you still have to figure out how to be with both of those concepts, that transitory kind of impermanent high consciousness idea, and the fact that it can really hurt. And so I really am grateful to be here and hear everybody's stories. So thank you so much.
And thank you so much for sharing more of your story that is part of, I understand, your call to help all of us have conversations before those last few moments, and the power of what you shared in terms of how children learn from not just what is said, but that energy and that nonverbal communication as well. So we are grateful to you for sharing that. Dr. Christopher Jones, this is your second time joining our Interfaith Paths for Peace. You were also on a very wonderful program with Soul Food, What is My America? So you have a lot of experience asking the hard questions. And you are an educator at JCPS amongst your many other attributes. And I know every time I've heard you talk about your work with your kids, I can hear the love in your voice and your passion for ensuring that they get their emotional needs met. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi Nadia, and to all the panelists. It's a pleasure being able to serve and share our experiences with the world, essentially. During this time of COVID-19, it's very challenging. It's very challenging to our students. It's very challenging to you all. It's very challenging to our America. And for whatever that is, I extend condolences. I extend my heart to each and every one of you during this time. I want to discuss trauma as well as grief from an aspect of a child, but I mainly want to talk to the adults as well as the community and how they approach children who live with and deal with trauma on a daily basis. Ironically, grief and trauma kind of wrestle with one another, but they're not the same. And so I really appreciate, Justin, how you were just very transparent. I mean, my heart just felt you. So thank you for that. But grief and trauma are not the same, but yet they wrestle with one another. So when we deal with children and trauma, we as adults must realize that children react to trauma in different ways. They don't deal with trauma in ways that adults may process trauma. And sometimes we even process trauma correctly, for that matter. So I want to give some tips and some tools and some strategies that can help us along the way. Encourage the child to openly share how they feel. Encourage that child to openly share how they feel. Because the reality is, as students and adults and children, it's better to act outward versus to act inward. Because the person who acts inward holds everything in. So we really don't know really what's going on with that individual. And so it might be too late because they kept it in. And we don't want any situation to be too late because we hold in our emotions, we hold in our feelings, we hold in our anxieties, we hold in our frustrations, we hold in our insecurities, we hold in all the negative emotions or even positive emotions, because we don't trust anybody enough to share those emotions with. So whether it's good or bad emotions, the person who holds it in, we have to really pray for the individual and encourage them as much as possible, or send spiritual positive vibes to those individuals, to encourage them to not act inward, but to express how they truly feel. Because having emotions is feeling, and when feelings are repressed and suppressed, then how can we heal? But we heal when we learn how to feel that emotion. So it's very important that we feel and allow students and children to feel those emotions. Allow students to grieve any losses, whether it's a loss of a best friend, loss of not being able to go to school on a regular basis due to COVID, not being able to play outside with our friends, having to wear a mask every day, and I'm a child. I don't understand that. So allow them to grieve any losses, whether you understand that particular loss or not as a parent. Allow them to grieve that particular loss. Now, I want you to discourage children from obsessively reliving traumatic events. Don't allow that child to obsessively relive that trauma, because if they obsessively relive that trauma, then they're in their minds, they're in their feelings, and they're not necessarily vocalizing how they feel because they're not explaining it, they're reliving it. So allow them to communicate, allow them to talk, get it out, express it. Children need to be able to de-stress. Allow children to de-stress. Adults need to de-stress, but children need to de-stress as well. And what does de-stressing look like? It's relaxation. It's being able to recharge. And if we don't know how to recharge, then we have to learn with our students to recharge, because it's very important. Now, some tips to help students recover from trauma. Point number one, you want to rebuild trust and safety. Rebuild trust and safety. So make sure that child feels safe again. Make sure they feel welcome. Make sure that they're not hurting as much as you can. So just make sure that their environment is conducive to them feeling safe. Encourage that child to pursue activities that they enjoy. Is it coloring? Is it writing? Is it journaling? Is it sports? Is it reading? Is it math? Whatever that activity is, encourage them to pursue something that they enjoy. Not too much gaming, but an activity that's going to enhance them in a positive manner. Children need to maintain routines. They need structure. Children without structure, children need structure, because when they don't have structure, they may not have balance. And when they don't have balance, there may not be order. And order breeds order. Disorder breeds disorder. That was for the adults. Now, speak of future things with your child. Speak of future things. Make future plans. Yeah, we're in COVID right now, but let's plan a vacation. Yeah, we're in COVID right now, but let's plan a trip to the museum, because not everybody can afford a vacation. We're in COVID right now, but let's plan a trip to the park. We're in COVID right now, let's wear our masks to the park. Let's remember social distancing, but plan things with that child, because the more you plan and engage with that child, the more you rebuild that trust that you may have lost with that child and may not even realize you lost trust with that child. Keep promises. As adults, we and educators, you cannot tell a child that you're going to do something and you don't do it. Whether it's big to you or small to you, a promise is a promise is a promise. So please keep your promises to that child. And another thing, it's very important, and I know I had to get close because it's important on this one. If you don't know an answer, it's okay that you don't know that answer. You don't have to be afraid to admit that you don't know something, because a child knows. Do you want to build that trust in that relationship with that child? Tell them the truth. And if you don't know something, let them know that you don't know, and let them know that you'll find out and get back with them, and then follow up with that child. during this time of COVID and anytime. Point number 2, limit media exposure. Too much exposure via this media and COVID and what's going on in our world can be traumatizing and traumatic to our children. So I'm not saying don't allow your child to be informed and be aware, but limit some of the exposure, because too much exposure of anything can be detrimental and deadly. Point number 3, engage your child. Engage your child. Provide opportunities to talk. Provide opportunities to talk with your children, but communicate with your children on an appropriate level, in an appropriate way. For example, if I had a conversation with Jason or with Dr. Head, and I said, let me introduce myself. My name is Christopher Jones, and I want to know more about what you do and what services that you offer. And then they start to share what they do. Why? Because they're passionate about what they do. So when we talk to children, don't just talk to them about what you want to talk about. Talk to them about what interests them, because the more a person talks about themselves, the more they feel good about themselves, and the more that builds that relationship, because people love to talk about themselves. As quiet as kept. So engage that relationship by allowing your friends, your peers, and your students, your grandkids, your cousins, your nieces and nephews to talk about themselves, because that builds that relationship. But when you talk to them about themselves, the critical thing is listening. Listening. Don't talk while they're talking. Listen. And don't listen unactively. You want to actively listen. Don't listen to respond. Listen to show empathy. Listen to understand. Listen to get an understanding, because that's very important. Because the more you build that relationship, the more they want to share, and the better you build that trust, and the better you build that relationship. Acknowledge and validate those children's concerns. You might think it's minimal, but acknowledge and validate it. As one of the gentlemen brought up, yes, Brother Mark. He said, yeah, you're gonna feel that way. You might feel sad for a long time. Thank you, Brother Mark. You might feel sad for a long time, but it's okay. But he acknowledged how that child felt. So when we acknowledge how childs feel and we validate them, then they feel engaged and they want to share more. They want to do more. They feel better about themselves because they were acknowledged. And so it's very important to acknowledge that child. And because when you acknowledge them, you reassure them. And when you reassure them, then they know that you're being honest with them and they're being honest with you. So then another tip number 4, is engage in physical activity. Engage in physical activity. So find a sport that your child enjoys and offer to play a game with them, whether it's a board game, a physical activity, a sports game, but play a game with them. Engage in a physical activity. When our kids come to school, I like to play chess with my children. I like to play basketball with my children. Sometimes I play kickball with the children. We go to the park and we walk the playground with the children. I engage children in Connect 4, flashcards. However I can engage our children to want to share and be engaged in learning and making learning fun. I'm all about it. And as parents and as community leaders and community members, we should be about that as well. Encourage children to take time to play outside, as I mentioned earlier. But remember, it's COVID, so practice social distancing and make sure they have masks. Schedule family outings. It's very important to do things with the family. It's very important. Family first. Everything else secondary. It's very important. Take care of your children. Take care of yourself. It's very important. Feed your child a healthy lifestyle, a healthy diet. That's very important. See, because if we when we cook at home, we save money. But also when we cook at home and we have dinner at the dinner table it's not about the food. It's about the quality time, which builds the relationship, which encourages the entire family, not just the child. Because it also allows us to engage and get to know one another in this busy lifestyle. So although I'm upset about the pandemic, it has realigned us and repositioned us to do things that matter more, or that should matter. And that's putting things in perspective. So I do appreciate the familyness, the camaraderie that has allowed my family in particular to re-engage in things like family time that are important. Limit sugars as much as possible, because sugar is the new gateway legal drug. So limit sugars. Too much sugar can make you go crazy. And it's very important to just have a healthy, balanced lifestyle. But practice self-care with your family as a whole and as your child. Self-care is very important. And as social workers, as educators, as community leaders, as people, we don't practice enough self-care because our lines get blurry, our boundaries get taken advantage of when we want them to and when we don't want them to. But self-care is very important. So learn to say no at times, learn to say yes at times, but balance. Balance is very important.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I think hopefully a lot of us can draw comfort in knowing that our kids are with educators as compassionate and wise as you, and so committed to building relationships. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Darcy and Jason, we have not forgotten you. We want to hear what you each have. Everyone was selected to be part of this panel because of unique gifts that you each bring and unique perspectives. So thank you so very much. Darcy, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Darcy. I am the early childhood mental health specialist for 7 counties, and I'm an art therapist and a play therapist by general, I guess, licensure and practice. And I work primarily, I've worked for a long time with very young children, birth to 5 and their families, and I have some older kids as well. But one of the things that I feel like happens with kids and with grief is that younger kids get kind of discounted. They don't remember that, they don't know, they don't need to know. And I know a couple of people have really talked about grief and talked about that it's not just when someone dies that grief comes up for kids, but that there's also losses of family members, losses of birth families for kids that end up in foster care or get adopted into additional families, and that those losses get internalized too. And so one of the things I always try to tell folks, and I've heard some people say this too, is give kids space to talk about that, answer questions as honestly as we can, and tell kids the truth. I think we, in developmentally appropriate terms, regardless of where they are and what their age is, I think we worry a lot of times about telling kids what really is happening, or telling kids what's really going on. And often parents will come to me and say, what do I tell them? And I'm like, well, I think we tell them the truth as much as we can. And I recognize there are times and there are pieces of information sometimes that parents don't want to share, especially when kids are older. I think we always tell them the truth, but I think even with younger kids that we do that, and we allow spaces for playing things, and we read stories, and we help them connect to other things like that. I think books can be hugely helpful for young kids to be able to have children's books that talk about that. I always feel like anytime there's something in a book, it helps kids go, oh gosh, if somebody wrote a book about it, then I'm not the only person in the entire world that's ever had this experience. That because somebody wrote a book about it. So there must be other people out there like that. when we can connect kids with other kids, I think sometimes that can be helpful too, to be able to have those conversations, and letting them ask questions and see their parents grieving as well. And I know Dr. Jones just talked about self-care. I think also for the adults that are around those kids, right? Self-care for the adults and making sure that they're putting on their own, airplane mask before they take care of the kids in their care, but also that they recognize that kids are going to grieve sometimes differently than adults do, that I always say, the stages of grief aren't necessarily in some sort of predictable order. I think there's just lots of ways that people demonstrate grief. And sometimes parents come and they say, well, they don't seem to care, or they don't seem to be doing it. And so then we have to watch their play and watch what's going on. Or the kid has somehow internalized, this isn't something we talk about. Or when I talk about this, it makes my parent cry. It makes people, I know Justin talked about that earlier, that sometimes then the message is, don't talk about this, right? So I sort of internalize those feelings that are going on. So making sure that we have safe spaces for kids to share, to play, safe spaces to be kids when we're talking about that, so that it's not constantly about that different kids are going to want to, sometimes it is going to look like they don't want to be doing this right now because they just want to go back and play baseball with their team. And we have to pay attention to letting kids grieve in their own time spaces too. And then I think whenever, and this is something I've been seeing a lot during COVID, that for a lot of kids, changes or other losses bring up old losses, right? So when I had a loss in the past, now all of a sudden, parents are coming back and going, well, that was years ago, and I kind of thought we had done that and moved through that, and all of a sudden they're talking about it again. All of a sudden they're bringing it back, and I'm like, well, new loss, new changes can sometimes bring that back for kids. And so trauma speaks to trauma, and grief speaks to trauma, and so those types of things can sometimes bring up other things. So even though it doesn't look like the kid is grieving in a predictable fashion, they're bringing up old stories or old questions, or all of a sudden their need for enhanced safety is coming back, when maybe it felt like they had kind of worked through that at other times. So paying attention to all types of loss that's specifically about death, or death of a loved one, death of a friend, any of those things, but also losses that have to do just with general things that get removed from kids, and loss of social connections, loss of predictable patterns and routines. And I think it's important to pay attention to those kinds of things when we're working with kids, and to give them spaces to do those things. I also think that it's important to make sure that we validate all the feelings and all the expressions kids are trying to make, right? That all feelings and all ways of expressing what's going on are valid for kids, and I think we pay attention to that as well, in honoring where they are.
Thank you so much, Darcy. We are grateful for your sharing of your wisdom with us and integrating that with everything that we've been hearing. Jason, there's an expression in Hebrew, acharon acharon chaviv, the last is the most beloved. So please know how much we appreciate what you are going to share. For those who don't know, Jason helps lead our Baha'i worship every Saturday morning, and has, during some of those times, shared some great resources for how to have conversations with kids. And he was also part of our first panel, talking about different religious traditions and how they deal with grief. So Jason, we're glad that you helped us start our conversation and that you are concluding this one, but it's pretty clear to me that we are going to have to continue having this conversation because there's so much more to share. We could dive deeply into everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi Nadia. My cup is full. I've learned so much today, and taken away wisdom really from everyone that is spoken. So I hope I can remember what I was going to say, because I'm still just sort of, like I said, full of all the wisdom and inspiration that everyone shared. So I'm just going to share two ideas, two concepts, two traditions, Baha'i traditions, and then two ideas that are just practical resources to help. So I'll do it briefly. I'm representing the Baha'i tradition. For those who aren't familiar, Baha'i is the most recent of the world religions, and the main idea is, the main essential concept is the unity of all the religions are being part of one divine process, and that the next stage of humanity being the unification of all the peoples of the world into one common fellowship. The two ideas that I want to share today, the first one is the essential nobility of every human being, and the ability, and in speaking with children and speaking just with all human beings, the idea that you have within you everything that you need to face any challenge, to overcome any obstacle, but that you also have a greater power in the universe to turn to draw on for strength and for inspiration. So very, basic concepts. We call them by different names and have different ideas for them. But with that essential nobility comes the ability of every soul, every person in potential to reflect what's called in the Baha'i traditions, all the names and attributes of God, and which you can call just all of the virtues for everybody else, right? Justice, mercy, humility, creativity, all of those possibilities are latent in every person. And so that is what enables you to overcome any obstacle, any challenge. And also, as is sometimes said, to basically convert darkness into light, that the purpose of spirituality, that the purpose of religion, faith, however you choose to characterize it, is to take difficult things, trauma, injustice, difficulty, and take those things and be able to turn them from darkness into light, into essentially power and strength. And there's this idea in the Baha'i tradition that the more of those things you have in your life, then the more potential you have for spiritual strength. So in some cases, you could look at it as the worst thing that could happen in life is that you go through it with, just sail through and don't have many challenges or difficulties or things to face, because then you have less and fewer opportunities to turn those into strengths of your own character. And so that's the first idea. The second idea is this idea that birth and death are actually similar processes. So, and the metaphor is that in the womb, this little person is being grown, and they are developing eyes, although they don't need them in the womb, right? They're developing arms and legs and lungs and a heart and all of these things, veins, no idea why or what they're going to need them for, right? But when they're born, then all of a sudden it becomes very clear, these are why I need these things. These are what give me the ability to navigate this world and to flourish and to live here. And it's the same way in this life that, we can think of death as our spiritual birth, our birth into the next world. But what we have here is the choice to develop those spiritual arms and limbs and organs. And those are those virtues that we talked about, right? Justice, mercy, compassion, overcoming anger, selfishness, and those things, and developing those pieces. So that idea is that what we are doing in this world is developing those qualities that are essential to who we are and what we will need and use in the next world. And sometimes it's counterintuitive to us. We don't always understand why we need to develop them. And sometimes it's very difficult and challenging and not always obvious. And in the same way that it's not necessarily obvious to a child in the womb why they're growing a hand and what are they going to need fingernails for, So those are the two ideas and the two resources that I wanted to share. The first is an app that is downloadable on iPhone and Android called Virtues Cards. And this was developed part of a Virtues project which was from back in the 1990s. Virtues Project looked at all the religious traditions of the world, the ones we know, but also looked at First Nations and indigenous traditions as well, and looked at what are these common threads? What are the common threads that run through them all? And what they found was that these ideas of there are a number of virtues. They found about 300 of these virtues that run throughout all of these traditions. And they've narrowed them down to about 50 that are represented in these cards. And these virtues cards have all of them. You do like a reading, it's sort of, there's an explanation of them, and then there's some ways to put them into action on the back of the card. They were physical, they used to be physical cards. Now it's an app, of course, like everything else. And so you can download it. There's a free sample cards, and then there's ones for teachers, there's one for families, there's ones for sort of reflection. There's different virtues decks as part of these cards. But those cards are very practical ways, and I'll give an example as a parent of how I used these in COVID era situations. So my daughter came to me one day and she was telling me about something that was like a challenge for her. And when we got to the end of the conversation, she was very frustrated and she says to me, you know, every time I try to talk to you about this, you don't listen, you don't actually hear me. And what I'm saying is I'm telling you about something that I need to sort of work through this sort of the challenges that we've got right now. And then she kind of, you know, went off and I went off, and then we, you know, later I went to her and I used one of these virtues, one of these things I learned on one of these virtues cards. And there's this on the Virtues Matter website, there's an example of this, of how to put these into practice, especially as a parent, really just as a human being. And what it was is you sort of speaking the language of virtues. So instead of going to her and saying, you don't talk to your parent like that, right? I don't care how mad you get or whatever, you know, that's not appropriate, which was what she was expecting me to say. So when we sat down to talk about it, I told her, I said, using sort of the Virtues Project sort of inspiration is I said, I want to honor your assertiveness in telling me how you really felt and being honest with me about, you know, what was going on. And she said, wait, what? Because she was expecting me to say, you know, you don't talk to your parent that way. And I said, look, I didn't fully understand that I wasn't listening to you, and that, you know, we need to figure out what was going on. And we worked through it, and then we found a solution, and it was much better. So the main idea of these virtues cards is, instead of giving people just a common, you know, oh, good job, good job, good job, you sort of name the virtue and the evidence, right? You say, I appreciate your helpfulness in doing the dishes because I didn't have time to get to it when I didn't have time to get to them, right? You took the initiative to do it. I really appreciate it. And so those virtues then build self-esteem, right? Because they see that's something in me that I have inherently. I don't need the praise from you saying good job all of the time to validate, you know, who I am or what I am as a person. So that virtues cards is a very practical way and has been very sort of useful, helpful during COVID time. The other one, and several, this is great because several panelists already mentioned this. If you have younger kids, though, sometimes the idea of like maybe mindfulness or meditation or even stopping and thinking or reflecting is pretty hard, right? They're pretty squirrely when they're younger. And so the idea of, several people have mentioned movement. And so this is something I did when my kids were younger. This is a book called Mindful Movements, Thich Nhat Hanh. So it's Buddhist. It's a wonderful, but Thich Nhat Hanh has a very, you know, universal appeal, I believe. And so it's kind of combines similar ideas from yoga and Tai Chi, and that of just getting kids up and sort of the idea of do some movements to think through some of these things and to focus your mind and maybe get your mind off of something that, like one of the panelists talked about, don't let kids like obsess over the same thing, right? Over and over again. That's one of the biggest challenges that sometimes that we all have. But when we're younger, sometimes it's hard to get past those things. And things like these like mindful movements are ways to go and focus your mind, focus your attention in ways that really you can think positively, and you can do different things with that too. There are things, some of these like if they do want to sit, some of the things you can have is like, we'll have like these little stones that have kind of ideas on them, and you take one of those, and sometimes when little kids, just holding on to that stone and thinking about like, what does that word, mean to you? And again, it gives them something to do, right? With like everybody's been saying, don't just expect a 7-year-old to sit still for 5 or 10 minutes, and even talk is a challenge sometimes, right? Give them something to do, something to play with, a way to move. Those kinds of things are very practical ways to sort of engage kids in sort of ways that play to their strengths. Let them, do the things that they're natural for and channel it, rather than trying to sort of take it and just always redirect it, So that's what I've got. Thanks so much for being here. It's an honor to be, with all of the like real experts that are on this panel. I'm happy to just share a couple of those, those thoughts.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you to all of you for your time, your wisdom, your vulnerability, your trust, and your courage in helping us begin to think about the many different components of what it might look like for us as individuals, as well as a community, to be supporting our kids during one of the more challenging chapters of our century. So I want to thank you all so very much for your wisdom and compassion. I feel like we should have another conversation and another, because our world, our kids, our adults, all of us need so desperately some of the wisdom that you each shared. So thank you very much for doing that. I don't know if we have time for any questions or not. I feel like,
why don't we do a 15, 30-second checkout with one idea or insight that everybody is coming away with, kind of to harvest
great idea,
the wisdom. Judd. So let's check out in reverse order. Or actually, let's check out in the order that we checked in. So if we can follow that order. And again, it's just 15, 30 seconds. So this is something I'm taking away from this conversation. A helpful idea or insight. How about that? So
in the same order. So that means, yeah. Joe, you're next.
So one takeaway is that we don't have to have all the answers at one time, that grief is unfolding, kids coping, their understanding is unfolding. We've got a lifetime for them to kind of digest and go deeper over time. So that's one takeaway I have.
Thank you. I think, Barbara, you're next.
Well, the one takeaway I would like for everybody to remember is to not be afraid to grieve with your children. You are their role model, so model for that healthy grief after a loss.
Thank you. Mark?
Boy, this was really enlightening for me. I think the fact that there were so many cross currents between what a lot of the speakers said, I thought it was going to get repetitious, and it was far from that. Also, being at the stage of my life that I'm in, I was very interested in everything Justin had to say, and will probably be following up on his fest.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely check out the Before I Die Fest. Justin.
So I'll just go ahead and put in a shameless plug for Before I Die Fest. Paula, Judd, myself, and Rabbi Nadia are kicking around some ideas for some programming over the next couple months. So stay tuned. I would love to follow up with some of you, actually all of you, and find ways to keep the conversation going. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for encouraging difficult conversations in our community. Dr. Jones.
Yes, I would. My biggest takeaway is tell your story, share your story, edit your story, and live your story. And then leave a legacy because of your story.
Thank you. Darcy?
been sitting here going, goodness, there's so many things. I mean, I think part of the biggest thing I always say is not to be afraid to have hard conversations with kids and to hold space for some of that. But also, as I look around at all of the beautiful people here having this conversation, that there are resources in the community. There are people to talk to and other people to connect with when having these conversations, or if you need to know more. And I think being able to reach out and find those connections would be my biggest takeaway.
Thank you so much. Jason.
Muted, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, so many, it's hard to pick one, but actually I just like the one that, you know, Dr. Jones said of just play with kids, you know, just make some time to play. That makes such a difference, just taking that little bit of time regularly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Let's
Karen,
also give Karen
yes,
and Paula a chance.
Karen and Paula, you've been part of our conversation, and we would welcome some thoughts that you have. Karen, you've unmuted first, so you get to go first.
Oh. Hi, everybody. Well, I want to say that I really appreciated Justin's story and hearing more of that. And just pastorally, as I think about working with children, you've provided me with a lot of resources and ways to order the work that I do. So thank you.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate everybody's input. We just celebrated the 2nd anniversary of my nephew's death. And so that's part of how I've gotten into this work, is the personal devastation and loss. And I think our family's doing a good job of doing a lot of the things that you guys have talked about here. We're very open in sharing the grief, and like, it's not something that happened to us past tense. It's something that happens every day, especially when you lose a child. And yeah, it's just, I think by our grieving, we allow other people to grieve as well. Both Robert's loss and my nephew Robert's loss and their own losses. It just kind of normalizes it. And so, yeah. Thank you all for being here and all your wisdom that you've shared.
Thank you so very much. And I will say that one of the things that I appreciated is the ways in which hope can be integrated into the healing process. And several of you spoke about that. Dr. Jones, you talked about it in very specific ways. Jason, I really appreciated the spiritual metaphor that you shared from birth to life, and then what we're doing now into the next life. And so many times as a clergy person or as a therapist, I see people feel like they need to grieve the end of a relationship, and often healing happens when they find new ways of connecting with their loved one, even past the body. So whatever that looks like, whether it's developing rituals to keep talking to their loved one in letters or prayers or dreams or pictures, maintaining that relationship, that it can continue to grow with us even beyond the physical loss. And of course, we want to be respectful of the many different ways all the world's religions think about that, and the fact that many of us don't subscribe to organized religion, but whatever hope looks like for that individual, building that up is, I think, a really important part. So I wanted to thank each of you for sharing of yourself and your wisdom, and also for finding new ways of integrating hope into the work that we can do to bring healing to our kids and our community, and of course ourselves. Judd, you get the final word.
Oh, wasn't that lovely? Thank you, Rabbi Nadia, and a deep bow to all of you for your wisdom and sharing of stories. And this is the idea behind this is the soul of the city. So are all of our responsibilities to care for our children, to care for one another. I'm continue to be interested in the collective grieving process. And we've talked a lot about individual grieving, and I'm still have some wondering about where are our collective grief spaces. I know that the Breonna Taylor Square is a place where there's a lot of grief happening and it being expressed, but it feels like we need to have those all around the city in some way. So we've talked about collective wailing wall, and not to take that away from the Jewish community, but where are the collective spaces of grief? And I'm thinking maybe next month, that's the conversation on grief, is where can we create collective grieving spaces? So anyway, let's keep thinking about that and keep in conversation. Again, deep bow and thanks to all of you all for being with us today, and hope you'll come back. At Interfaith Paths to Peace does programs every 9 o'clock every in the morning with different devotionals from different religious traditions. And then at 3 o'clock, we do different learning conversations just like this one. So come back and join us. Also, I want to let you know, Interfaith Paths to Peace is now taking nominations for our Peacemaker Awards. So we're giving out 5 awards this year. So if you have somebody you'd like to nominate, you can go on and there's a Google form to fill out to give a name, and we're going to be taking those into account. And then on our Recipe for Peace, which is our yearly fundraiser, we're going to be giving awards and announcing the winners of those awards to recognize peacemaking in 5 different categories. So go on our Interfaith Paths to Peace website and you can find that link. Again, deep bow to all of you. Thanks. May we be a community that helps one another grieve through all of the life changes and transitions in our lives. Peace. Thank you all. You're welcome to unmute and say your goodbyes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Great to meet everybody.
Consider yourselves invited to our next conversation. We would love to talk about communal grieving and ways we can all work together to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your wisdom
Thank you all.
today.
Peace.